Miss Marple and the murder at the little village market. Dear friends, a warm welcome back to Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, and I'm truly thankful to have you here with me tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and which city holds a special place in your heart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us again for more cozy mysteries. Now, get comfortable, and let's begin. Chapter 1. A spread of sponge cake and shortcrust. Morning had come to Wenbury Holt with that curious hesitancy so often found in the English countryside in early summer, as though daylight itself were uncertain whether the village deserved brilliance or merely politeness. At first, the sun had seemed inclined to reserve judgment. By 9 o'clock, however, the matter had been decided. The sky was an uninterrupted blue, the sort of sky that gave no warning at all, and the parish hall, standing with both doors thrown wide, welcomed the warmth with an air of modest civic pride. Inside, transformation had been achieved by effort rather than elegance, though the effect was no less striking for that. Mrs. Aldis and her committee had laboured through the previous afternoon with a devotion bordering on the ecclesiastical. Trestle tables had been laid with white muslin cloths ironed so sharply that their corners seemed almost capable of disapproval. Hand-lettered signs in Mrs. Aldis's unmistakable schoolmistress hand directed visitors with unwavering authority. Jams and preserves, bread and savoury pastries, cakes and sweet baking, and at the far end near the stage the long and much-considered table for competition entries. It was to this last table that eyes returned again and again. There is a very particular expression worn by people observing a village baking competition. It combines admiration, rivalry, false modesty, and a fervent hope that one's own contribution has been properly noticed. It had settled now over much of Wenbury Holt. The village itself was not large, but like most small English villages, it possessed a social complexity wholly disproportionate to its size. There was the Norman church, perpetually in need of repair, the post office that also sold tinned goods and practical footwear, 3 public houses of uneven respectability, and some 400 inhabitants whose lives were quietly interwoven with one another through memory, opinion, habit, and observation. The annual summer bake sale had been a fixture for nearly 30 years, each June producing a fresh harvest of cakes, preserves, whispered grievances, and money for whichever portion of St. Edmunds had most recently surrendered to weather and age. This year the south transept was under sentence. Last year it had been the vestry guttering. Before that, the bell tower. The church, it was agreed by all, remained both noble and financially inexhaustible in its requirements. Miss Jane Marple arrived at 9:45 with her knitting bag over one arm and that mild, benevolent expression upon her face which had so often encouraged the careless into indiscretion. She was a slight white-haired woman well into her 70s, and her blue eyes, though gentle, missed very little. She had come to Wenbury Holt 3 weeks earlier to visit her old friend Mrs. Partridge, whose troublesome knee had prevented her from moving about with former ease, though not in the least from supervising village affairs by report and inference. Miss Marple had originally intended to remain a fortnight. She had extended her stay. Places where the air was pleasant and the people observably human had always held her rather longer than she planned. Now she accepted a cup of weak tea from the vicar's wife, settled herself near the refreshments corner, arranged her knitting with neat fingers, and began, as she so often did, the business of appearing entirely unoccupied, while noticing everything that mattered. The hall filled steadily. Women arrived in flowered frocks, and hats brought out for the occasion. Men wore collars suggesting respectability rather than comfort. Children, kept at carefully measured intervals by anxious mothers, hovered near the competition table with the suppressed desperation of youth denied sugar in its most decorative form. The vicar, Mr. Thornbury, moved through the room in a state of genial concern that seemed divided equally between the souls of his parishioners and the roof above their heads. Yet the true centre of the morning was not the vicar, nor even the church fund, but the competition table. The entries were excellent. a Victoria sponge of remarkable height, held the central place with the self-importance of a reigning dowager. Nearby sat a dark, solemn fruitcake wrapped in greaseproof paper and tied with a bow so exact it appeared almost moral in character. There were scones of alarming uniformity, a walnut loaf of sober virtue, and at the nearer end a lemon tart so beautifully executed that it seemed less baked than engineered. Its pastry was pale gold, perfectly blind-baked, its filling smooth, glossy, and level with the kind of confidence that speaks either of mastery or very considerable self-command. That tart belonged to Mrs. Clara Bennet. Clara Bennet was a woman of about 40, fair-haired, slim, and dressed in pale blue with an instinctive neatness that called no attention to itself. She possessed a stillness that, in some women, might have suggested shyness. In Clara, it suggested something more difficult to define. She ran a modest catering concern, supplying cakes and cold dishes for private events in the neighbouring villages, and had earned a reputation for taste, discretion, and reliability. She stood near her entry now, conversing quietly with another woman, her expression composed in a manner that might have been interpreted as calm. Though Miss Marple, who had known too many varieties of human calm, was not certain serenity was the correct word. The second woman was Mrs. Helen Carter, and the contrast between them was immediate and illuminating. Helen was handsome, energetic, broad-shouldered, and visibly competent. She moved as if rooms naturally made space for her. She spoke with a firm, practical confidence, and her ginger cake, rich and traditional, had been entered with the unmistakable expectation of being taken seriously. Her manner toward Clara was not overtly hostile, it was merely careful. Clara's manner toward Helen was equally careful in return. Miss Marple observed the exchange over the rim of her teacup and made a small inward note. Carefulness between two women over a baking table was not, of course, uncommon, but carefulness of that particular sort, controlled, courteous, and watchful, often had deeper roots than pastry. At 10 o'clock precisely, the judge arrived. Mrs. Dorothy Mere entered the hall to a small ripple of applause. She was 72, a long-established and formidable figure in village life, and one of those women whose authority had become so habitual that it was no longer questioned, only adapted to. She had funded the restoration of the Lich Gate, contributed generously to the village school library, and for 23 successive years had judged the bake competition with a finality that was treated, if not always adored, as irrefutable. She was a substantial woman in every sense, financially, socially, physically, and morally convinced of herself. Her grey-green silk dress conveyed dignity and indifference in equal measure. Her pearls were real, her white hair perfectly pinned, her opinions no doubt equally secure. She moved through the room with measured assurance, bestowing greetings as a queen might bestow pensions, kindly, but with a clear understanding of rank. Miss Marple noticed, as such things were worth noticing, that the warmth of Mrs. Mere's greeting to Clara Bennet was polite, but reserved. To Helen Carter it was distinctly easier, almost approving. A very slight difference, perhaps. But in villages, and indeed in murder, slight differences are often the beginning of understanding. The judging began. Mrs. Mere approached the competition table equipped with a small silver fork, a plate, and the solemn concentration of one performing a public duty she regarded as significant. She proceeded methodically. The Victoria sponge was sampled and considered. The fruitcake received attention of a rather graver kind. One by one she advanced through the entries, making notes upon a small card. There was no haste in her movements and no frivolity in her assessment. Then she came to Clara Bennet's lemon tart. Here, Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest fraction of a second. Mrs. Mere took slightly longer over the tart than she had over the others. That in itself might have meant nothing. A tart requires proper cutting, neatness matters. Yet when she lifted the fork to her lips and tasted, something changed. Not dramatically, not enough that the room would have remarked it. But Miss Marple saw the tiny alteration of expression, the faint inward pause, the almost imperceptible stilling. It was not quite displeasure. It was not surprise exactly. It was thought. Then the expression vanished. Mrs. Mere made a note and moved on. Later, when the blue ribbon was announced, it was awarded to Clara Bennett. There was a murmur of approval, a small flutter of surprise, and all the little emotional adjustments that follow an unexpected victory. Helen Carter received the news with composure, though a shade too promptly perhaps, for the composure to be entirely effortless. Clara Bennett accepted the ribbon with gratitude and what appeared to be relief rather than satisfaction. Mrs. Mere, announcing the result, spoke of the excellence of the pastry and the precision of the filling in tones that were gracious but faintly proprietorial, as though good taste itself operated under her supervision. For a little while after that, the bake sale resumed its natural course. Tea was poured, money collected, and comments exchanged over sponge density and the price of gooseberries. Then Mrs. Mere faltered. It was done quietly. She was crossing toward the refreshment table when she stopped, laid one hand upon the back of a chair, and stood very still. A committee member was immediately at her side. She was helped into a seat. Water was brought. Concern gathered around her, but she discouraged fuss with the irritable dignity of a woman who objected more to weakness than to pain. The afternoon went on, though in a changed key. Mrs. Mere remained seated for the rest of the proceedings. Eventually her niece, a practical young woman who had driven her there, assisted her to the motor car and took her home. Around the hall conversation lowered itself instinctively, taking on that muted quality with which communities greet an event not yet understood but already felt. Miss Marple put down her teacup and allowed her gaze to move. Quietly across the room, Clara Bennett was folding a tablecloth with meticulous hands. Helen Carter was speaking to the vicar with brisk self-command. And near the doorway stood a woman unknown to Miss Marple, watching both of them with a look in which curiosity and calculation were mixed in notable proportion. That also, Miss Marple thought, was worth remembering. Mrs. Dorothy Mere died that evening at home. The doctor, when later consulted, described it as heart failure, consistent with her age and the exertions of the day. The village accepted the news with appropriate sorrow and a sense of the loss of something long assumed permanent. Miss Marple accepted it with sympathy as well, but privately she reflected that the day had not in fact been particularly warm, and she had never yet found imprecision in a medical explanation as comforting as other people seemed to do. Chapter 2. The Judge's Sudden Collapse. By breakfast the next morning the death of Mrs. Dorothy Mere had travelled through Wenbury Holt by every established route of communication. Domestic servants, telephone calls, shop counters, and the irresistible momentum of village interest. The post office learned of it first in any official sense, by way of Mrs. Aldis, who had heard from the niece, who had telephoned Mrs. Partridge's cook, who in turn had seen no reason not to pass the matter into responsible circulation. By 9 o'clock the news had settled across the village like an invisible mist, chilling, not because it was wholly unexpected, but because it had so swiftly transformed yesterday's mild concern into finality. Mrs. Partridge received the news in her usual chair by the sitting-room window, from which position she commanded the green, the gate, the front path, and most of the moral movement of the village. Her troublesome knee had kept her from attending the bake sale, a deprivation she bore with less resentment than one might have expected, since it left her perfectly free to gather information from a superior position. She listened to the account, nodded gravely, and remarked that Dorothy Mere had never, in all the years she had known her, shown the smallest willingness to slow down for anybody, including Providence. Miss Marple, seated opposite with knitting in hand, murmured that it was very sad indeed. Thereafter, as was her habit, she asked one or two little questions, not important questions on the face of them, merely the sort that arise naturally in conversation when an elderly lady is being sympathetic. Had Mrs. Mere been robust generally? Was Dr. Fenwick attending? Had there been any suggestion of earlier weakness? Was the niece devoted? Had the day been thought too much for her? Mrs. Partridge, who enjoyed facts and had no reason to suspect they were being arranged into any pattern, answered readily. Dr. Fenwick, it appeared, had been Mrs. Mere's physician for 12 years and was considered a sound country doctor. Steady, sensible, not at all given to imaginative theories. He had certified cardiac failure. Mrs. Mere's heart, he believed, had for some time been functioning below ideal efficiency, and the strain of a public event, combined with the weather and fatigue, had proved too much. Miss Marple nodded and said that a peaceful death, when it came, was a mercy. Then, after the tiniest pause, she asked whether there had been much talk of the bake sale itself, of the competition, the ribbon, and the result. There had. Mrs. Partridge, requiring no greater invitation, explained that Clara Bennet's victory had occasioned a good deal of discussion. Not because Clara's baking was doubted, far from it, but because Mrs. Mere had, in recent years, developed what she referred to as a preference for the traditional school, by which she generally meant dense cakes, respectable flavours, and the sort of stolid excellence Helen Carter represented so well. To award first place to Clara's refined lemon tart suggested either a shift in Mrs. Mere's judgment or some other influence which people, not unnaturally, were finding it difficult to classify. Changes of taste in old age can be quite revealing, Miss Marple said mildly. Mrs. Partridge agreed, though she did not specify of what. The conversation moved on, as village conversations do, to money. Dorothy Mere's relationship with village finances was a delicate subject, only in the sense that everyone knew perfectly well how essential she had been. For years she had been the principal private support of the Church Restoration Fund, and the vicar had depended upon her annual generosity with something approaching theological confidence. What was less widely advertised, but by no means secret, was that Mrs. Mere had recently been considering a redirection of part of her giving. The idea had originated with Helen Carter. Helen, practical and energetic as ever, had proposed the establishment of a scholarship fund for village children bright, enough to attend the grammar school at Ashworth, but not sufficiently financed to manage it easily. The scheme was admirable, useful, and deeply attractive to the kind of public conscience Dorothy Mere liked to imagine in herself. There had even been talk, Mrs. Partridge said, that the fund might one day bear Dorothy Mere's name. Mrs. Mere had met Helen more than once on the matter, and had spoken to the vicar in tones suggesting intention rather than polite interest. Mr. Thornbury, confronted with the possibility that St. Edmund's Roof might lose ground to education, had borne the prospect with Christian restraint. Miss Marple went on knitting. A redirected donation is not, of course, the same thing as a withdrawn one, yet those whose hopes depend upon where money falls are often quite capable of distinguishing between the two. It occurred to Miss Marple, as she turned the heel of her sock, that charitable rearrangements could produce emotions of surprising force beneath very respectable surfaces. That afternoon she walked to the parish hall. Several committee members were there engaged in the melancholy dismantling that follows all village events, taking down bunting, folding trestle tables, stacking chairs, and restoring the hall to the bare plainness from which community enthusiasm briefly rescues it. Mrs. Aldis was directing the process with firm efficiency, the activity seeming to steady her spirits. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, for they had already exchanged enough words for Mrs. Aldis to decide that Miss Marple was a sensible person. In the course of their conversation, conducted among folding chairs and scraps of string, the events of the previous day were carefully reviewed. Mrs. Aldis had been among the first to reach Mrs. Mere when she faltered. She described the episode with the exactness of someone who had already replayed it several times in memory. Mrs. Mere had seemed entirely normal throughout the earlier part of the morning, perhaps a little slower than usual, but not alarmingly so. She had taken only moderate refreshment, a glass of lemonade, a cup of tea later on, and the competition samples during judging. There had been no sign of distress until some 10 or 15 minutes after the ribbon had been awarded. Then, quite suddenly, she had stopped and needed support. Miss Marple listened without interruption. After a moment she asked, in a tone so gentle it barely seemed to matter, whether Mrs. Aldis had noticed how Mrs. Mere moved along the entries. Had she sampled them strictly in order? Had she returned to any item? Had any one entry occupied her longer than the others, Mrs. Aldis thought. No, Mrs. Mere had not returned to anything twice, so far as she recalled. She had proceeded in a fairly systematic fashion. She had paused somewhat longer at the lemon tart, certainly, but then a tart did require proper cutting, and Clara Bennet's entry had been placed near the end. Miss Marple agreed that this was perfectly natural. It usually is, she reflected, when a thing is either genuinely innocent or very nearly the reverse. Leaving the hall by the side door, she found herself crossing the churchyard in company with Helen Carter, who appeared upon some errand of her own, and greeted Miss Marple with the composed readiness of a woman who does not mind being seen under strain, provided she's seen at an advantage. Helen looked much as she had the day before, though her expression had altered subtly. The confidence of anticipated success had gone. In its place was something firmer and perhaps more interesting, the orderliness of disappointment already absorbed and filed away. She spoke of Mrs. Mere's death with evident sincerity. Whatever else might be said, Dorothy Mere had been generous, influential, and impossible to replace. Miss Marple expressed agreement. Then, with that air of elderly curiosity which so often served her better than direct inquiry, she remarked that she had heard Mrs. Mere had taken a real interest in Helen's scholarship idea. Helen acknowledged it at once. Yes, Mrs. Mere had, she believed, been seriously committed to the scheme. She only hoped now that the family would think it right to honour those intentions, for the children's sake. The words were entirely proper. The tone was measured. There was no crude resentment in it. And yet Miss Marple heard beneath the composure the quiet mathematics of a thwarted expectation, a careful balancing of what might have been secured, what had perhaps nearly been secured, and what now lay in uncertainty. Helen was a woman who had evidently schooled herself against display. But feeling, like bad icing, has a way of showing at the edges. They parted amicably. Miss Marple took the longer route home by the lane where the dog roses were beginning to bloom against the old stone wall. The afternoon had clouded over. The sunlight was diffused into a pale luminosity that softened everything without clarifying it. She walked slowly, thinking. Composure, she reflected, is one of the commonest disguises in the world. It appears in the guilty and the innocent alike. The timid may seem calm because they fear exposure. The determined may seem calm because they have passed beyond fear. And women, particularly, are taught all their lives to fold their disturbances neatly out of sight. Clara Bennet had not appeared at the hall that afternoon. That was notable. Her modesty the previous day had been eloquent in its own way. So too had Helen Carter's poise. 2 women, 2 entries, 1 dead judge. And somewhere, in a quiet house, a blue ribbon resting beside a lemon tart that had caused Mrs. Dorothy Mere, if only for a moment, to think before she smiled. At the gate of Mrs. Partridge's garden, Miss Marple paused and looked up at the whitening sky. There was, she felt very strongly, a pattern beginning to show. But at present one saw only the corners. Chapter 3. A recipe card, altered by hand. The morning after a death is always, in a village, a morning of a very particular character. The machinery of daily life continues as it must. Milk arrives at doors, gardens are watered, shutters are opened, notices are pinned, and the post office conducts its transactions with the same conscientious slowness as ever. Yet beneath all this ordinary motion there lies an alteration almost too delicate to describe. Conversation is softer. People pause before speaking. Even trivial remarks seem to be made with a sense that something else, larger and less comfortable, is listening. In Wenbury Holt, on the second morning after the bake sale, that atmosphere was everywhere. At garden gates, voices were lowered instinctively. The greengrocer's boy, usually a reckless figure on his bicycle, went by with unwanted restraint. Even the rooks in the elm behind St. Edmund's appeared for once to have surrendered argument for contemplation. Miss Marple, who had observed the grammar of village sorrow for longer than most people had been alive, found the effect not merely touching, but useful. Mourning, like scandal, has its own pattern of emphasis. It tells one very often not only what has happened, but what people fear may yet be discovered. She had risen early and spent half an hour before breakfast in Mrs. Partridge's garden, where the grass still held the dew, and the first bees of the day were proceeding with their business among the lavender in a manner both practical and faintly severe. Her knitting lay quiet in her lap. She was not truly working at it. She was thinking, and thinking rather particularly about Clara Bennet. There was something in Clara Bennet's manner that had lodged in Miss Marple's mind with unusual persistence. At the bake sale, Clara's modesty had been almost too exact. There are women who are genuinely embarrassed by praise, just as there are women who appear embarrassed because they know embarrassment is expected of them. The distinction is not always obvious. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that a person who produces something of considerable skill and care is not usually quite so disconcerted by admiration as she wishes others to believe. Clara Bennet's lemon tart had not been the work of a timid woman. It had been the work of a precise one. It was over breakfast that the first really useful detail emerged. Mrs. Partridge, who never seemed to introduce important facts with any sense of ceremony, remarked in the course of discussing village capabilities that Clara Bennet was known to keep her recipes in exemplary order. It was partly professional habit, no doubt, since Clara's small catering business depended upon reproducibility and exactness. But even by professional standards, her methods were notably thorough. She kept index notebooks as well as individual recipe cards for competition entries, preserving not merely ingredients and method, but amendments, variations, and the practical history of what had worked and what had not. Miss Marple said that sounded admirably organised. Mrs. Partridge replied that Clara had always been very thorough. Indeed, nobody denied it. She added, however, with that air of balanced judgment, which often masks very definite opinions, that thoroughness and warmth were not invariably found in company with one another, and that Clara Bennet, though certainly pleasant, possessed a reserve some found difficult to penetrate. This, combined with what Miss Marple had already observed, suggested that a call might be worth making. Accordingly, she went to Clara Bennet's cottage at 9:45, having sent a small note the previous evening to say that she hoped to stop by if convenient. The cottage stood on the eastern side of the green, modest, neat, and quietly well kept, with a small front garden in which colour and order had been achieved in approximately equal proportion. The geraniums in the window boxes were so evenly spaced that they gave an impression almost of discipline. The path had been recently swept. Nothing was untidy. Nothing was accidental. Clara herself opened the door. She received Miss Marple with quiet courtesy, the courtesy of a woman who'd already decided what impression she meant to convey and was now executing the matter carefully. She wore a subdued grey-green dress appropriate to the day, and there was upon one cuff a light dusting of flour not quite rubbed away, suggesting that work had been interrupted for the sake of civility. They sat in a small sitting-room that also served, with admirable efficiency, as a working space. Along one wall ran a low shelf filled with notebooks, each labelled in Clara's neat hand. On the table stood a tea tray, and set slightly aside to make room for it, a small stack of recipe cards. Miss Marple noticed the cards with the kind of casual glance that in reality misses nothing, and then turned her full attention to Clara's face. They began, naturally, with Mrs. Mere. Clara spoke of Dorothy Mere with what Miss Marple judged to be genuine sorrow, though carefully regulated sorrow. Mrs. Mere had, she said, always been encouraging. The village would feel the loss of her experience and authority. It was all very properly said, yet the tone was interesting. Clara was not speaking of a beloved friend, nor was she speaking of an enemy. She was speaking of a figure who had mattered, perhaps more than she wished to confess. Miss Marple, with gentle indirection, remarked that she had heard the lemon tart was a recipe Clara had made before. Clara said yes several times. It was one of her most reliable preparations. Miss Marple said that one must, in such cases, grow rather attached to a recipe perfected by repeated effort, and that any alteration to it must feel significant. There was the slightest pause. Then Clara said, very naturally, that she had indeed made a small last-minute adjustment. In her most recent preparation, she had felt that a slightly reduced quantity of lemon zest gave a more balanced result when used with a particularly rich butter. It was only a minor change, she added. Miss Marple said that sounded extremely sensible. Then, with the air of an old lady mildly interested in systems of order, she asked whether Clara kept all her competition cards among the general collection or separately. Clara indicated the stack upon the table and said that the lemon tart card was there if Miss Marple cared to look at it. The offer was made freely, which was in itself significant. Miss Marple accepted it with a little murmur of interest and examined the card in a leisurely, harmless fashion. It was written neatly in ink, clear, organised, and comprehensive. The method was set out with admirable exactness. At the point where the zest quantity appeared, however, there was an amendment. A single figure had been crossed through, not violently, not concealed, but cancelled with a clean, deliberate line. Above it, in a slightly lighter ink suggestive of a different pen, or at least a different moment, a revised quantity had been added. Miss Marple looked at it again. The crossed-out figure was not larger, as Clara's explanation required. It was smaller. In other words, the amendment had increased the quantity of zest rather than reduced it. Miss Marple replaced the card with a pleasant smile, and gave no sign that anything in particular had struck her. She merely observed that it was a most well-kept record and that precision in such matters was everything. She herself, she said, had once spoiled a perfectly good marmalade by trusting her own untidy notation at the wrong moment, an error she had not repeated. Clara smiled. It was a brief smile, but perhaps a shade less guarded than before. Then, while Miss Marple's attention seemed to wander harmlessly about the room, she became aware of a sound in the passage outside, the almost inaudible movement of someone who had approached, paused, and decided not to advance further until formally admitted. A moment later there was a knock at the door. Clara excused herself. The visitor was Helen Carter. Helen appeared only moderately surprised to find Miss Marple there, which suggested that surprise, if felt at all, had already been swiftly put in order. She accepted the offer of tea with the ease of a woman who had called many times before, and sat in the chair Clara indicated with a familiarity that did not quite belong to recent acquaintance. The three women spoke of Mrs. Mere, of the bake sale, and of the small gathering the vicar intended the following week, a village occasion to be described no doubt as one of communal reflection, which in practical terms would mean subdued conversation, tea, and concentrated observation of one another. It was Helen who mentioned the recipe card. She did so lightly, almost idly, in the course of admiring Clara's methodical habits, the notebooks, the records, the care with, the alterations, so professional, so exact. Her gaze fell briefly upon the card on the table, and she remarked that such alterations were often the most interesting part, were they not? They showed the thinking process, the point at which one had changed one's mind. Clara replied evenly that perhaps they did. Helen then said that she had thought the tart at the bake sale had possessed a particularly pronounced quality of flavour. Distinctive, really. She wondered whether the adjustment to the zest had been responsible. The words were perfectly polite. The tone was perfectly polite. The subject changed almost immediately, and yet something had been said, something all three women understood to be not entirely about lemon zest. Miss Marple, pouring herself a second cup with placid unconcern, reflected that culinary discussion was sometimes one of the most convenient and elegant forms in which accusation could be dressed. The altered figure on the recipe card remained at the edge of her, thoughts like a pin half visible beneath fabric, a record of a change, a decision revised, something removed or added at the last possible moment before a thing was completed and set before a judge. She did not yet know which sort of change it had been, but as she gathered her knitting bag and took her leave, she knew very well that it was a question worth following. Outside, the lane was full of the ordinary music of an English June morning, a thrush declaring itself from the hawthorn hedge, the distant progress of a delivery van, the soft, intermittent tap of laundry moving upon a line in the breeze. Miss Marple walked back toward the green at an unhurried pace. She was thinking about alterations, and about the sort of mind that makes them. A correction made hastily is one thing. A correction made later, in different ink, upon a card otherwise composed with complete order and self-command, is quite another. Chapter 4. Aprons fastened a little too firmly. There is a particular pleasure in a fine June afternoon when it asks nothing urgent of anyone. It does not insist upon labour, nor does it confine one indoors. It merely permits existence in a garden chair with sufficient comfort that the world may be watched while appearing not to be watched at all. Mrs. Partridge's garden was especially suited to this sort of occupation. The herbaceous border had reached that happy stage of the early summer, in which everything is committed, though not yet extravagant. The bench beneath the apple tree had been placed at precisely the right angle. One could see the kitchen window, the garden gate, and the path beyond without any vulgar suggestion of surveillance. Miss Marple sat there that afternoon with her knitting and her thoughts, and both were advancing in a neat, measured fashion. She had been considering, with the quiet patience she found more reliable than excitement, the relationship between Clara Bennet and Helen Carter, not as two separate women, which was very much how each seemed to prefer to present herself, but as a pair. Pairs are often revealing. There are friendships which end in noise and declaration, and there are friendships which cool by degrees, like a room from which the fire has been allowed to go out. These latter are often the more interesting. They leave behind a chill not quite acknowledged and never wholly dispersed. Miss Marple had already gathered, chiefly from Mrs. Partridge's observations, that the friendship between Clara and Helen had altered in the previous year, and that the annual bake sale had something to do with it. But the exact outline was still missing, and in Miss Marple's experience it is usually the exact outline that explains why people behave as they do. It was Mrs. Thornbury who supplied it. The vicar's wife arrived that afternoon with a pot of honey from the parish apiary, and the absorbed expression of a woman carrying information she had not yet decided whether discretion required her to retain. Mrs. Partridge welcomed the honey warmly and ushered her in for tea. Miss Marple, setting aside her knitting, arranged her face into that expression of kindly receptivity which so often encourages the confiding. Conversation moved, as village conversation must, from Dorothy Mere's death to the bake sale, and from the bake sale to those most closely associated with it. Then Mrs. Thornbury said, with careful casualness, that she had always thought it rather sad the way things had changed between Clara Bennet and Helen Carter. Miss Marple replied honestly that she had understood there had been some change, though not the particulars. Relieved to find the subject not forbidden, Mrs. Thornbury explained that the matter, when one came to it, had begun in something very small indeed, which, as Miss Marple knew, is how such things generally begin. At the previous year's competition, Helen Carter had entered a coffee and walnut layer cake which, by all accounts, had been exceedingly good. Indeed, village expectation had fixed upon it almost from the moment it was placed on the table. It was thought to be the likely winner. Yet when the judging came, the cake was disqualified. The reason was technical. The competition rules required each entry to be identified not by name, but by a sealed number, in order that judging might remain impartial. Helen's cake, through some oversight, had been labelled incorrectly, not by number, but in a way that rendered its maker identifiable. It was not a dramatic breach, nor a dishonest one, merely an error. But the difficulty was that the error had not been discovered by the committee. It had been noticed by Clara Bennet. Clara, passing the competition table shortly before judging began, had seen the label and quietly pointed it out to Mrs. Aldis. Mrs. Aldis, once aware, had felt duty-bound to act. Helen's entry had been removed. The ribbon went elsewhere. No one had openly accused Clara of anything improper. That would have been too blunt, too ungenerous, and in any case impossible to prove. But villagers do not require open accusation in order to form opinions. Clara's own entry had been in direct competition with Helen's. The timing had been unfortunate. The effect was undeniable. Miss Marple asked whether Helen had spoken to Clara afterward. Mrs. Thornbury said yes. There had been a conversation, civil, entirely civil, which, she added with some feeling, was perhaps the worst possible kind, because a quarrel may burn itself out, whereas civility, when built upon injury, has an unpleasant tendency to preserve everything intact beneath the surface. Helen had accepted Clara's explanation that rules ought to be applied consistently. Yet from that time onward, whatever quiet closeness had existed between them had not returned. Miss Marple said that such losses were not easily repaired. Then she inquired whether Helen had won the competition before. Mrs. Thornbury said that Helen had won twice in the preceding 5 years and had been runner-up once besides. She was, everyone agreed, a baker of very considerable talent. Not Clara's sort of talent, which was fine, restrained, almost architectural in its precision. Helen's gift was richer, more instinctive, more generous. Dorothy Mere had always admired it, which was why last year's disqualification had seemed especially harsh. When Mrs. Thornbury had gone, insisting that the honey must certainly be kept, Miss Marple remained very quiet for some minutes. The picture was becoming clearer. Clara had reported the error. Helen had lost the competition. Dorothy Mere had upheld the rule with no special softness toward the woman disadvantaged by it. The friendship had cooled, but not shattered. Then a year passed. Another bake sale arrived. Clara returned with her immaculate lemon tart. Helen returned with her ginger cake. Dorothy Mere presided once again over both with all the certainty of a woman long accustomed to deciding outcomes. Miss Marple resumed her knitting and reflected that the social texture of the affair was considerably more knotted than the wool. The following morning she encountered Clara Bennet near the post office. Clara was posting a small parcel, and doing so with the brisk neatness that characterised nearly all her movements. They fell into step together with the slight formality of two women who have reached acquaintance without quite reaching ease. They had gone as far as the green when Clara slowed a little, as though some inward decision had at last been made. Without preamble, and without looking directly at Miss Marple, she said that she imagined the story of last year's competition was something Miss Marple had probably heard by now. Miss Marple said that she had heard something of it. Clara was silent for a moment, then said that she had thought about the matter a great deal over the past year, and was still not entirely sure she had acted rightly. She had seen the label. She had known the rule. In the moment it had seemed to her that consistency was the only defensible course, that to overlook the error for one person would be unfair to everyone else who had complied properly. She still believed that in principle. She spoke in the manner of a woman who has repeated an argument often enough that she no longer knows whether she believes it or merely knows it by heart. Miss Marple said gently that principles were very often correct and very often insufficient, which was one of the more inconvenient facts of moral life. Clara glanced at her then, sideways, with a brief expression in which surprise and something close to relief were oddly mingled. It was the look of someone who has expected either approval or condemnation, and has been met instead with understanding. She said that she and Helen had once been close, not demonstratively close, not in the bustling fashion some friendships adopt, but in a quieter way that had mattered much more to her. A habitual closeness, built of shared errands, small talks, mutual assumptions, and the easy use of each other's houses. She had not expected, when she spoke up about the label, to lose that. For a long time afterward she admitted she'd told herself that Helen would understand in time. Helen had not understood. Or perhaps, Clara added with careful exactness, she had understood perfectly well, which in some ways was worse. That sentence interested Miss Marple very much. They parted at the corner of the green, and Miss Marple watched Clara's neat, self-contained figure move away along the pavement. She found herself thinking of aprons, specifically of the kind tied too tightly, as though sufficient discipline in the outer arrangements of life might somehow prevent the inward disorder from showing. She had known several women of that type. Indeed, in her experience, they were among the most reliable indicators that a situation deserved close attention. For the tighter an apron is tied, the more likely it is that something significant lies beneath the effort at control. And Clara Bennet, Miss Marple thought, had tied hers very tightly indeed. Chapter 5. The donation that had been promised. There is something about an English village on a grey morning that resists any genuine accusation of dreariness. The sky may be the colour of old pewter, the roses may bow their heads beneath the residue of night rain, and the lane may acquire that particular dampness which renders it neither pleasantly wet nor comfortably dry, and yet the village itself, its chimneys, shop fronts, moss-softened walls and modest enduring roofs, continues with the composure of something that has survived a great many grey mornings and expects, with complete justification, to survive a great many more. Wenbury Holt on the fourth morning after the bake sale presented exactly this aspect. Rain had fallen in the night, gently and without drama, and by breakfast everything appeared washed and provisionally renewed. The garden beyond Mrs. Partridge's back sitting-room window shone with a subdued freshness. Water still gathered in the crook of the apple tree's lower branch and dropped at intervals with a measured contemplative rhythm. Miss Marple ate a light breakfast, folded her napkin with the neatness of long habit, and settled afterward with her knitting in the chair beside the window. She had slept well, and more importantly, had woken with that quiet inward certainty which comes when the mind has continued its work during sleep and arrived, without fuss, at a clearer arrangement of facts. This morning the matter occupying her thoughts was not the tart alone, nor Clara Bennet, nor even Helen Carter, though both women remained centrally fixed in the pattern. It was the scholarship fund. She had been thinking about benevolence. It is a subject, Miss Marple often felt, which rewards careful thought, and very seldom in the sentimental direction people expect. Benevolence is not merely the impulse to give, it is also the decision of to whom one gives, and under what terms, and with what understanding, conscious or otherwise, of what that giving will mean. A donation is never only money, it is a relation. The giver retains, in ways often denied and even more often misunderstood, a certain authority. Gratitude may be expected. Dependence may quietly form. Approval may become a currency of its own. Dorothy Mere, by every outward measure, had been generous. But generosity, Miss Marple reflected, nearly always possesses an architecture. It was on this damp, reflective morning that Mrs. Partridge received a caller. Mr. George Alderton, solicitor, of the small Ashworth firm which had managed Mrs. Mere's affairs for more than 20 years. He was a compact man of 55, careful in dress, precise in speech, and of that professional type accustomed to negotiating the delicate borderland between money and feeling. He had come, ostensibly, to pay his respects. He had also, it quickly became clear, come in the hope of acquiring some measure of local intelligence, while disclosing as little as professional prudence allowed. Mrs. Partridge, who enjoyed information in nearly all its forms, welcomed him for coffee with perfect composure, and introduced Miss Marple simply as a dear friend visiting from the next county, very sensible. A description which managed to be both accurate and remarkably uninformative. Mr. Alderton bowed over Miss Marple's hand with polite indifference, the sort of attention one gives an elderly visitor whose significance has not yet been assessed. Within a quarter of an hour, however, he was speaking with rather more candour than he had likely intended. Miss Marple had long ago ceased to be surprised when this happened. The matter of Dorothy Mere's charitable arrangements, it emerged, was not straightforward. The annual donation to the Church Restoration Fund had been a standing instruction, renewed year by year and not subject to dispute. That was fixed. What remained uncertain was a second arrangement, a specific pledge, made verbally and in Mr. Alderton's presence approximately 6 weeks before the bake sale, to provide the founding endowment for the scholarship fund Helen Carter had proposed. The pledge had been noted in a memorandum of intention, but had not yet been transformed into a binding legal instrument by the time of Mrs. Mere's death. The estate, Mr. Alderton said, using the cautious neutrality of a man who's formed an opinion but knows better than to present it too freely, would have to consider the question in due course. Miss Marple, who was stirring her coffee with complete placidity, asked whether there had been any indication in the weeks preceding the bake sale that Mrs. Mere had been reconsidering that pledge. Mr. Alderton looked at her for just a moment with an expression of slight professional surprise. The question had clearly struck a little nearer the heart of matters than he had expected from an elderly guest in a flowered sitting room. He admitted that there had been one further conversation, some 3 weeks before the sale, in which Mrs. Mere had raised what he described as a separate consideration. That separate consideration concerned Clara Bennet. Mrs. Mere, it appeared, had for some time maintained a private undertaking, not formal in a legal sense, but serious enough in intention, to provide Clara with a sum of money that would help her expand her catering enterprise. She had encouraged Clara from the beginning, and had come, over time, to regard the business with a proprietary sort of interest. Yet in recent months Mrs. Mere had begun to feel, as she put it to Mr. Alderton, that Clara's ambitions were perhaps exceeding the natural scale of the enterprise. He did not say the word at once, but Miss Marple, piecing together tone and implication, thought of it almost before he reached it. Mrs. Mere had begun to fear that the whole matter was becoming, in her judgment, a little unseemly. She had not formally withdrawn her support, but she had been reviewing it. When Mr. Alderton had gone, after some further careful exchanges and a respectful leave-taking, Miss Marple remained in her chair for several minutes without resuming her knitting. For those who knew her, this was a sure sign of concentrated thought. The picture had widened considerably. Dorothy Mere had occupied, whether she recognised it or not, a position of influence over two women whose hopes, pride, and self-command were differently entangled with her approval. To Helen Carter, she had offered the prospect of a scholarship fund, public in character and lasting in effect, a philanthropic legacy which might carry her name into the future and clothe Helen's ambitions in dignity and practical authority. To Clara Bennet, she had offered something more personal and perhaps more dangerous, private patronage, encouragement, and the kind of approval upon which a capable but inwardly uncertain woman might come to depend far more than she intended. Two women, differently favoured, two futures, both in some degree contingent upon Dorothy Mere's continued goodwill, and, between them, a bake competition which had become rather more than a matter of pastry. That afternoon the vicarage gathering took place. It was a modest assembly of perhaps 20 villagers in the Thornburys' sitting room, a large and slightly worn room furnished for living rather than show. Mr. Thornbury offered a few words of tribute to Mrs. Mere, which were sincere and mercifully brief. After that, the occasion dissolved into the informal pattern common to such gatherings: tea, low voices, subdued recollection, and the mutual reassurance, under the shadow of loss, that life was continuing and that one's neighbours were continuing with it. Miss Marple found herself, in the course of the afternoon, speaking at some length with the woman she had noticed earlier at the bake sale, Mrs. Evelyn Forsyth. Mrs. Forsyth was a widow of about 60, who had lived in Wenbury Holt for a decade and occupied the useful position, socially speaking, of a person with no direct stake in the village's most enduring rivalries. Such people often observe with unusual clarity what those involved can no longer see at all. She had known both Clara Bennet and Helen Carter throughout her time in the village and spoke of them with that balanced affection which generally indicates real fondness mixed with substantial exasperation. In her view, she said, The two women were more alike than either would ever comfortably admit. Both were capable, both were proud, both had in their different ways made the mistake of letting Dorothy Mear's opinion matter, rather more than was good for them. Miss Marple asked how she meant. Mrs. Forsyth replied that Dorothy had indeed been a good woman, and she said so without reservation. But she had also been the kind of woman who never quite surrendered the conviction that her approval was a resource others needed, and that she was therefore entitled to grant or withhold it as she judged proper. It was not cruelty, Mrs. Forsyth said, merely the long habit of influence, uncorrected by any substantial inconvenience. Clara had needed Dorothy's approval for the confidence it lent her work. Helen had needed it for the credibility it lent her plans. Dorothy had given, encouraged, delayed, questioned, approved, and hesitated. And neither woman had ever fully learned how to proceed as though her judgment didn't matter. Miss Marple thought about this on her walk back through the damp evening air. The lane smelled of wet grass and some flowering thing she could not immediately identify. Rain had left the paving stones reflective. Patches of the last light lay among them like fragments of tarnished silver. Dependency of that kind, she thought, was always dangerous. Patronage, however kindly meant, could become a quiet form of governance. One sense of worth is gradually adjusted to another person's favour, until the moment comes when that favour shifts, or seems about to shift, and the whole inward balance is threatened. What one does in that moment, Miss Marple reflected, is very much the question. At the garden gate she paused for a moment in the dim, fragrant dusk before letting herself in. The apple tree still released the occasional drop from the afternoon's rain, and somewhere in the hedge a blackbird concluded his evening observations and fell silent. She would need, she thought, to speak to Clara Bennet again, and soon. There was a great deal, she suspected, that Clara had not yet said. Chapter 6. Exchanges beside the raffle table. The sun returned on the 5th day with the brisk assurance of English summer weather, temporarily interrupted and now reasserting its claim. By mid-morning the lane outside Mrs. Partridge's house was dry again, save where the deeper stones still held a darkness left by the rain. Wenbury Holt had resumed that curious fine-weather liveliness common to villages, purposeful, unhurried, and entirely confident that something pleasant might occur if one only remained out of doors long enough. Miss Marple, who found grey weather excellent for thought, and bright weather equally suitable for its practical application, set out at 10 o'clock with no declared destination, and a very definite one in mind. She walked along the high street at the pace of a woman merely taking the air. At the post office she purchased a book of stamps she did not especially need, and exchanged several minutes of agreeable conversation with Mrs. Holt, who presided over the counter with the combined authority of someone responsible not only for the village's postal arrangements, but for a substantial portion of its unofficial intelligence. Their talk moved, as such conversations naturally do, across the weather, the cost of things, the gathering at the vicarage, and at last, by the inevitable gravitation of village speech that week, to the bake sale and Dorothy Mear's death. It was then that Miss Marple remarked, with the harmless recollection of a visitor impressed by local efficiency, that she had found the raffle stall particularly well run. Positioned by the main entrance, she said, it had seemed to her an excellent arrangement, and the young woman managing it had been cheerful and capable. Mrs. Holt responded at once that the stall had been run by Patricia Simmons, Dot Simmons's eldest girl, very dependable Patricia, and no nonsense about her. She had been helped throughout the afternoon by Mrs. Barbara Renfrew, a newer arrival in the village who had joined the committee only that spring. Nice enough, Mrs. Holt added, though not quite settled in yet, not in the way people eventually settle when they know where everything is, including where they themselves stand. Miss Marple said that must be Mrs. Renfrew of N Cottage on Ferris Lane, the one with the climbing rose. Mrs. Holt confirmed this with mild surprise, as though a visitor of only a few weeks' standing might reasonably be expected to know fewer things. Miss Marple smiled vaguely and tucked the stamps into her bag. she found Mrs. Renfrew in her front garden at 11:15, trimming back the very climbing rose in question. Barbara Renfrew was a woman of perhaps 38, with the slightly over-eager sociability of someone newly arrived in a village and still labouring a little too hard to make herself part of its fabric. She was warm, talkative, and, Miss Marple judged almost at once, exactly the kind of person likely to say more than she intended, provided she was made to feel both interesting and safe. Tea was offered and accepted. It was made quickly, poured generously, and within a very short time the conversation had reached, with hardly any steering, required the events of the bake sale. Mrs. Renfrew said she had found the afternoon most enjoyable, up to a point. Mrs. Mere's collapse had cast a dreadful shadow over it naturally, but before that it had seemed to her a charming village occasion. She and Patricia Simmons had run the raffle stall from around noon until the prize-giving at 2, which meant, she said with a small laugh, that she had developed quite a thorough acquaintance with all the comings and goings near the entrance. Miss Marple observed that such a position must have provided a rather interesting view of things. Mrs. Renfrew agreed. She had seen nearly everyone at one point or another, some of them several times. She had sold raffle tickets to people she knew, and to people she was only just learning to distinguish. The whole afternoon had been, in that respect, a most useful introduction to the social geography of Wenbury Holt. Miss Marple asked, in the easy way of someone piecing together a harmless memory, whether from the raffle stall one could see much of the competition table. Mrs. Renfrew said one could see part of it, the nearer end where the sweet baking entries were displayed, if one happened to look in that direction. The far end, with the savoury items, was largely obscured by another trestle. She had not been studying it closely, of course, as the raffle kept her occupied, but she had noticed one or two things, as people naturally do. Miss Marple waited. Mrs. Renfrew continued. At some point during the hour before judging began, she could not be exact, but the hall was already fairly full. She had noticed Helen Carter standing near the competition table. That in itself had not struck her as remarkable, since other people had been hovering there too. But Helen had remained for what seemed rather a while, and specifically near the sweet entries, the very end where Clara Bennet's lemon tart had been placed. Miss Marple said mildly that Mrs. Carter had doubtless been looking at the entries with the natural interest of a fellow competitor. Mrs. Renfrew said yes, she had assumed precisely that. She had not seen Helen touch anything, she added carefully, because she had not been watching with that degree of concentration. She had merely noticed her there, and then noticed later that she was no longer by the table, but speaking to Mr. Thornbury nearer the door. Then she hesitated. There had been, she said, another thing. Around roughly the same time she had been aware that the competition table, or at least Clara Bennet's position behind it, had been briefly unattended. Clara had been there for most of the morning, but for perhaps 10 minutes, possibly a little less or a little more, she had not been at her place. Mrs. Renfrew had assumed she had gone to fetch something. People do, after all, disappear briefly at such events for perfectly innocent reasons. Miss Marple agreed that this was certainly the natural assumption. She thanked Mrs. Renfrew warmly for the tea, admired the rose through the kitchen window, and took her leave with the satisfied air of someone whose morning call had been entirely social in purpose. But as she walked back toward the green, her pace was slower. The information Barbara Renfrew had provided was not decisive. Proximity is not guilt. An unattended table in a crowded parish hall is hardly extraordinary. Yet facts of that kind are not valueless merely because they are ordinary. On the contrary, ordinary facts are often the very ones from which the structure of a crime must eventually be made. Helen Carter had been lingering near Clara's entry. Clara Bennet had been absent from her place for a period of time. Taken separately, the facts meant little. Taken together, and in light of everything Miss Marple had already learned, they suggested a question which had not yet fully formed in her mind, but which was becoming more insistent with every passing day. She was still considering this when, near the corner where the High Street met the church lane, she encountered Mrs. Aldis. Mrs. Aldis was carrying a basket and wearing the brisk expression of a woman who had been conducting several errands simultaneously and was doing all of them competently. They stopped for a few minutes' talk, as people do in villages and especially at corners. Miss Marple remarked that she'd been thinking what an admirably organised event the bake sale had been. Managing the competition table, she said, must require a good deal of forethought. Mrs. Aldis agreed that it did, and added that the rules had become rather more detailed over the years thanks to various difficulties, the labelling incident the year before being only the most recent example of what occurred when competitors were not sufficiently attentive. Miss Marple said she could well imagine it. Then, as though continuing the same harmless line of thought, she mentioned that she had just seen Mrs. Renfrew, who had said the competition table had been briefly unattended before the judging. Mrs. Aldis said that yes, she believed Clara Bennet had needed to fetch her serving plate. She had left it in the hall kitchen earlier that morning and had gone back for it just before the judging. Mrs. Aldis thought she'd been away perhaps 5 or 10 minutes. She herself had been occupied near the entrance at the time by some absurd disagreement over the tombola, and had not been in a position to watch the competition table closely during that interval. She said this with the slight self-reproach of a woman who half feels she ought to have been in 2 places at once, and has not quite forgiven herself for the physical impossibility of it. Miss Marple assured her that no one could be everywhere, which was unfortunate but true. They parted with mutual warmth. Miss Marple sat down for a few minutes on the bench at the edge of the green before returning to lunch. Around her the village moved in its quiet, ordinary rhythm. A cat crossed the pavement with the purposeful indifference of a creature that takes no interest in human affairs, but possesses a considerable understanding of where they tend to lead. 2 small children argued amicably over the ownership of a stick. The clock in St. Edmund's Tower informed the village that it was nearly noon. Opportunity, Miss Marple had once remarked to a young inspector, is seldom as decisive as motive. But it is for all that a necessary part of the accounting. One must have wished to do a thing, one must have had the means to do it, and one must have had the moment in which to act. Remove any one of those 3, and the sum fails to resolve. She had, she thought, a much clearer sense now of motive. She was beginning, too, to glimpse the means, and the moment, that small, ordinary, unremarkable interval when a table in a crowded parish hall stood briefly unattended, had now, in its quiet way, been accounted for. Chapter 7. An ingredient purchased in a rush. The village grocer's shop in Wenbury Holt occupied a position upon the high street that, Miss Marple judged, had been given over to groceries for at least 60 years and very likely longer. It had the particular fragrance such establishments always acquire when they have been properly lived in by commerce. A pleasant blending of dried goods, beeswax, paper, tea, and the faint ghost of something aromatic long since sold, but not quite forgotten. Everything within it was arranged with that thoughtful density peculiar to village shops of the older kind. Shops that have, over decades, learned with accuracy what 400 souls may unexpectedly require on a Tuesday morning, and have somehow made provision for all of it in a space that appears, at first glance, much too small. The proprietor, Mr. Ernest Baverstock, was a man of 60 with iron grey hair, excellent manners, and the unhurried completeness of attention that belongs to those who have spent a lifetime supplying both goods and conversation in equal measure. He had inherited the shop from his father, and with it had inherited too that comprehensive knowledge of customers, which is one of the highest forms of village scholarship. He knew what people bought, what they had last run short of, what they preferred when they had a choice, and what they pretended not to want but almost always purchased in the end. Miss Marple had taken to him at once. On her second day in the village, having found herself unexpectedly short of wool in a particular shade of blue, she had gone in on the off chance that such a thing might be available. Mr. Baverstock had produced it from a drawer beneath the counter, with the quiet satisfaction of a man accustomed to meeting needs others would have dismissed as improbable. Their relations had since been most cordial. She entered the shop on the 6th morning ostensibly in search of honey. Mrs. Partridge's supply had been finished at breakfast, and the previous jar having been a gift from Mrs. Thornbury rather than a purchase, Miss Marple felt it only proper to replace it from the same general source. Mr. Baverstock produced 2 varieties and described their relative merits with the earnest precision he brought to all discussions involving stock. Miss Marple listened with genuine interest, selected the lighter of the 2, and paid with the exact change, a habit she had long found productive of goodwill in shopkeepers. The conversation that followed was not hurried. Mr. Baverstock was between customers. The morning had reached that agreeable interval in which the first necessities had already been purchased, and the later errands not yet begun. He was a man to whom speech seemed as natural a part of trade as weighing tea or pricing butter, and Miss Marple, who was never in a hurry when information might be ripening, allowed the exchange to broaden gradually. She remarked, in speaking of the bake sale and its preparations, that the days immediately preceding such an event must produce a noticeable increase in custom. All those last-minute ingredients, she said, all those final little adjustments to recipes when one is already committed and yet not quite satisfied. Mr. Baverstock agreed at once. The Wednesday before the sale, he said, had indeed been lively. He remembered selling flour in quantity, a particular soft brown sugar that Mrs. Aldis always insisted upon for her tea bread, and a replacement bottle of vanilla extract to someone who had discovered, at a critical moment, that the old one contained scarcely more than fumes. He recounted these matters with the pleasant vagueness of a man speaking of ordinary retail experience rather than anything of consequence. Miss Marple, matching him in tone, observed that it was often the less ordinary items one remembered best. Ingredients one did not sell every day. Purchases that stood out a little from the common run. Mr. Baverstock considered this. Then he said that yes, now she came to mention it, there had been one purchase that week somewhat outside the usual line, a flavouring extract. Not an article he sold often, though he kept a small quantity because once in a while somebody wanted it for a special recipe. A concentrated botanical preparation, he explained, something employed occasionally in baking, though more commonly, in his experience, in herbal confections and certain flavoured cordials. He had sold a bottle of it, on the Thursday before the bake sale, to Mrs. Helen Carter. Miss Marple said that she would not, somehow, have associated Mrs. Carter with herbal confections. Mr. Baverstock replied, with the conscientious fairness of a man determined not to imply more than he knew, that people's culinary interests were often wider than one might suppose, and that in any case the extract was quite harmless in ordinary quantities. He had sold it without concern and would do so again. There was a very slight deliberateness in the way he said this, suggesting that he had already perceived the possible direction of inference, and wished firmly to establish that he had no intention of encouraging it. Miss Marple said she was sure he was perfectly right, and changed the subject at once to the question of whether he expected fresh Wensleydale before the end of the week. She left the shop carrying her honey and a small packet of biscuits recommended with such conviction that refusal would have seemed almost hostile. Her pace along the high street was unhurried. To anyone observing her, she was merely an elderly lady enjoying the weather after a successful village errand. Inwardly, however, her thoughts had become very active indeed. The extract now took its place beside the altered recipe card, the unattended competition table, Mrs. Mere's pause over the tart, and her collapse after the judging. Each item remained distinct, not yet joined into its final pattern, but all were clearly drawing together. The difficulty about Helen Carter's purchase was not that the extract was sinister. Mr. Baverstock had been entirely right. It was harmless in ordinary use. No, what made it significant was its timing and its unusualness. Helen was not, by all accounts Miss Marple had heard, a woman given to exotic culinary experiments. Her ginger cake was traditional, generous, assured. It belonged to the solid school of baking Mrs. Mere had generally favoured. One may, of course, purchase an unfamiliar ingredient for a dozen innocent reasons. Yet to do so 2 days before a competition in which more than a ribbon might be gained or lost, That was a fact worth carrying carefully in the mind, and it was a fact connected with Helen, not Clara. This interested Miss Marple greatly, because by now she had become increasingly certain that the question before her was not a simple one, with one straight line of intention leading to one neat conclusion. Human beings rarely arrange themselves so conveniently. What one often finds instead is overlap. One person considering a thing, another fearing the same thing, a third drawing back at the last moment, and all of them leaving traces which, taken singly, mislead and, taken together, begin at last to clarify. She turned the matter over as she walked, approaching it not directly but gently, as she always approached the more delicate truths. One does not seize such things. One waits and lets them show themselves. The afternoon brought her an unexpected opportunity. After lunch she was sitting in Mrs. Partridge's garden, the weather remaining obligingly fine, when Clara Bennet appeared at the gate. She held a small parcel and said she had been passing, and hoped she might find Miss Marple at home. She had brought some preserved lemons for Mrs. Partridge, made the previous autumn and long intended for delivery. The explanation was undoubtedly genuine. It was also not the whole explanation. Miss Marple invited her in with real warmth and carried the preserves upstairs to Mrs. Partridge, who received them with the sort of delighted approval home preserves invariably inspire in those who understand what labour lies behind them. When Miss Marple returned to the garden, Clara had seated herself in the second chair with the slightly rigid composure of a woman who has come for a purpose and is not altogether certain how best to approach it. For a little while they sat in silence, listening to bees and the distant drone of someone mowing grass somewhere beyond the hedge. Then Clara said, without much preamble, that she had been thinking about what she had told Miss Marple during their walk. Miss Marple waited. Clara said that she had not been dishonest. Of that she was quite certain. But she had perhaps been less than fully forthcoming, and on reflection she felt she ought to correct that. Miss Marple said that partial frankness was often a sign of a conscience in good working order, which on the whole was something to value. Clara looked at her steadily, and something in her expression altered very slightly. The subtle adjustment of a person who has braced herself for blame and received understanding instead. Then she said that Mrs. Mere had spoken to her privately about 3 weeks before the sale. The account was delivered with great precision. Mrs. Mere, she said, had not expressly withdrawn her financial support for the proposed expansion of the catering business. She had, however, raised doubts about the timing. She wondered whether the present moment was really suitable, whether Clara might not do better to consolidate what she already had before reaching for more. She had spoken with the measured gravity of a woman convinced she was offering prudent guidance and entirely unaware of how the guidance would land. Then Clara used the word that had remained with her. Mrs. Mere had said that she feared Clara's ambition was becoming unseemly. She said the word flatly, without drama, as though it had been, turning in her mind ever since and had lost none of its force in the repeating. For a moment Miss Marple said nothing. The bees went on among the lavender. Somewhere beyond the wall the lawn-mower reached the end of its course and turned. At last Miss Marple said gently that it must have been a painful thing to hear. Clara said yes, and because she said it simply, without embroidery or self-pity, it was all the more revealing. Miss Marple looked out across the garden and thought, as she had thought many times in her life, about injured pride. It is among the quietest of wounds and the most durable. It makes very little show of itself in people of disciplined character. Instead, it settles inward and remains there, altered by recollection, sharpened by silence, growing steadily in places where no one sees it. Clara Bennet, she thought, was exactly the sort of woman in whom such a wound might live a very long time. Chapter 8. A recollection of last year's fair. Memory, Miss Marple had often reflected, is both the least dependable of witnesses and the most indispensable. It alters as it is retold. It softens, hardens, rearranges, and occasionally improves upon the facts, in obedience to later feeling. And yet, beneath all those revisions, it usually preserves some small original core of truth that resists total erasure. The difficulty lies not in finding memory, but in disentangling what it first recorded from what life has since persuaded it to mean. On the 7th night of her stay in Wenbury Holt, Miss Marple slept less well than usual, not from discomfort, but from that lucid and purposeful wakefulness which sometimes overtakes the mind when a problem is very near its proper arrangement. She lay in the pleasant darkness of Mrs. Partridge's spare room, listening to the owl in the churchyard elms and fitting together, with the patience of a seamstress working a complicated join, the several pieces of what she had learned. By morning she had not resolved everything, but she had resolved one thing with certainty. Before she went further, she must return to last year, not merely to the labelling incident, which by now she understood perfectly well, but to the fair itself, to the atmosphere, the social texture, the emotional event that had apparently lodged itself so deeply in Clara Bennet's mind that it still exerted force a full year later. Mrs. Partridge, who could be consulted on village history with the ease of a well-indexed reference work, provided the first instalment over breakfast. Last year's bake sale, she said, had in most outward respects resembled the present one very closely. The same hall, the same bunting, the same undercurrents of vanity, hope, and domestic competition. The weather had been hotter, which had not improved tempers. Dorothy Mere had been, if anything, more emphatic in her judgments than usual, which was saying something. The incident Mrs. Partridge remembered most clearly concerned Clara's entry. Whether it had been a particularly fine sponge or perhaps a lemon drizzle she could not now swear with certainty. But Dorothy Mere, having sampled it, had said in that carrying public voice she never seemed to moderate that it was a very neat piece of work, but it lacked depth. She had gone on. Clara's style, Dorothy had said, was technically accomplished, certainly, but inclined toward the decorative rather than the substantive. Perfectly respectable in a domestic baker, no doubt, but perhaps a limitation in one aspiring to a professional reputation. All this had been said in full hearing of the table, the nearby competitors, and a gratifying number of interested bystanders. Mrs. Partridge recounted the matter with an expression suggesting she had found it indefensible at the time, and had not, over the intervening year, found any more charitable interpretation. She said that Clara had stood through the whole of it with a stillness far more painful to watch than any display of emotion would have been, and had thanked Mrs. Mere for her comments in a voice utterly without inflection. Miss Marple thanked her and spread her marmalade thoughtfully. Later that morning she went to the church, ostensibly to look at some brass memorial tablets Mr. Thornbury had mentioned as being of local interest. In reality she wanted quiet. The interior of St. Edmund's, cool and dim after the brightness outside, gave it to her. As she stood among the old pews and weathered stone, she found herself thinking not of theology but of humiliation. Public humiliation, she reflected, operates differently upon different temperaments. The dramatic, the impulsive, the vainly emotional may flare up at once and be done with it. But Clara Bennet was not that sort of woman. She was a woman of deep and orderly feeling, a woman who would not release what hurt her until she had turned it over from every angle, named it precisely, and fitted it into her private understanding of the world. That is admirable in many ways. It is also dangerous, for people of that kind do not forget an injury. They do not declaim it. They do not convert it into noise. They carry it inward and tend to it with care, and in the carrying it often becomes larger, more coherent and more powerful than it was on the day it was first received. Miss Marple sat for a little while in a pew near the south window, where the light came through the old glass in a muted greenish wash, and found herself once more thinking of the recipe card. She had thought of it often since her visit to Clara's cottage, and each time her certainty increased. The crossed-out figure, the revised measurement, the alteration in different ink and evidently at a different moment, these were not the casual traces of ordinary kitchen adjustment. They recorded reconsideration, a decision made, or nearly made, and then changed. The outline was becoming clearer. Clara had prepared her lemon tart with her usual precision, at some point shortly before the sale, in one of those final hours when a thing has almost passed beyond recall but not entirely. Something had been added or contemplated, something that was not the innocent alteration of zest she had described. And later, on the card, the record of that alteration had been partly revised. What exactly had been added, and whether it had been added with full intent, Miss Marple could not yet prove. But Helen Carter's purchase of the botanical extract sat uneasily beside it all, not because Miss Marple believed Helen had tampered with Clara's tart. There was no evidence of that, and Mrs. Renfrew had seen nothing of the sort. No, what unsettled Miss Marple was the possibility that Helen, too, had, in her own fashion, approached the edge of the same dark consideration. 2 women, 2 injuries, 2 possible inclinations, and perhaps 2 different final decisions. This thought occupied her as she left the church by the side door and crossed the churchyard. Among the stones, newer inscriptions still sharp in the sun, older ones softened by decades of weather into partial oblivion. At the lich gate she paused and looked back. The church stood in the morning light with the patient solidity of something that had observed human folly over centuries and found very little of it unprecedented. As she came out onto the lane, she saw, some 20 yards away near the war memorial, Clara Bennett and Helen Carter standing together. They were talking. It was not an easy conversation. That much was evident even at a distance. Their postures were a shade too still, too carefully managed to suggest comfort. Yet they were there, and speaking, which in itself, given all Miss Marple now knew of the breach between them, was a fact of some consequence. She did not approach. Instead, she walked quietly on, giving no sign of having noticed them at all, and privately observed that something between the 2 women was no longer fixed in pure hostility. It had entered another phase. Not resolution, perhaps, but reconsideration. That afternoon she went by invitation to tea with Mrs. Evelyn Forsyth, whose company she found increasingly valuable. Mrs. Forsyth's cottage was full of books, very good china, and the sort of comfort that comes from a woman having arranged her household entirely according to her own standards, rather than anyone else's. They spoke of many things, and, as was inevitable, arrived at the bake sale and those most closely connected with it. It was then that Mrs. Forsyth mentioned something she had not said before. She had been present throughout last year's judging, and had stood close enough to Dorothy Mead and Clara Bennett to hear every word of the exchange about the cake. She described it with careful exactness. Dorothy's remarks, she said, had been entirely characteristic. Damaging, no doubt, but not in any sense deliberately cruel. Dorothy had merely said what she thought, as she always did, with insufficient imagination about how it would be received. In Mrs. Forsyth's opinion, this lack of imaginative consideration was one of the gravest social defects, and by no means a rare one among people long accustomed to authority. Then she added the really important thing. What had stayed with her most was not Clara's stillness during the remarks, that she might have expected, but Clara's expression in the instant before she had composed it away. It had been, Mrs. Forsyth said, the look of someone who had understood something very clearly and had instantly filed that understanding away where it would remain undisturbed. Miss Marple asked gently what she thought Clara had understood. Mrs. Forsyth considered this. Then she said she believed Clara had understood in that moment that no amount of skill, care, patience, or excellence would ever quite alter Dorothy Mead's fundamental estimate of her. That the approval she'd been working toward did not in fact exist in the form she had imagined, and that from that moment onward she would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Outside, a wood pigeon made its repetitive observation from somewhere in the garden. Sunlight lay in warm oblongs across the rug, and Miss Marple thought that she knew now, not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to understand not only what might have happened at the bake sale, but why. And in her experience, why was always the harder question. Chapter 9. the silent calculations of resentment. There comes, Miss Marple had often thought, a very particular moment before any difficult conversation when one must decide, not what one hopes to hear, but what one truly means to accomplish. Most people, she had observed, never troubled to make that distinction. They went into such conversations declaring to themselves that they wanted the truth, or an explanation, or justice, when in reality what they wanted was relief from uncertainty, relief from discomfort, relief from the exhausting strain of having felt that something was wrong without yet being able to say exactly what. It was a confusion both common and understandable, though rarely useful. Miss Marple had learned long ago that unless one settled the purpose first, the conversation itself was liable to wander into all the wrong territories. In the matter of Clara Bennet, she did not want a confession in the formal sense. She had no authority that would make such a confession procedural, and no desire to play at cold accusation. What she wanted was something quieter, and perhaps more important. She wanted Clara to understand that she was understood. That, Miss Marple believed, was often the thing most needed and least offered. People became so preoccupied with the mechanics of what had been done that they neglected the deeper question of what had driven it, what private injury had hardened into action, and what cost had already begun to accumulate within the person who had acted. So on the morning of the 8th day she sent Clara a note. It was written in her clear, careful hand, and asked whether she might call that afternoon for a short visit. She added, with deliberate simplicity, that she had been thinking further about their previous conversations and had something she wished to say. No more than that. Miss Marple had always found that plainness, where it was possible, had a way of drawing truth more effectively than any elaborate tact. The reply came before noon. Clara brought it herself, arriving at Mrs. Partridge's gate with a folded note in hand and an expression which suggested that she had already spent some time deciding whether to move toward the matter or away from it. She had chosen to move toward it. She said that Miss Marple would of course be welcome, and added, after the slightest hesitation, that if it suited her she would rather receive her in the kitchen than in the sitting-room. She had been baking that morning, and the kitchen felt easier somehow. Easier perhaps to talk honestly in a room where work had been done. Miss Marple said she understood that perfectly, and they settled on 3 o'clock. When she arrived, the kitchen was warm with the lingering life of recent baking. There was the sweet, faintly caramel scent of pastry cooling after the oven, and upon a rack near the window stood 2 tart shells and a fruit loaf arranged with the exactness that always distinguished Clara's work. Nothing in the room was careless. Everything had its place, as though order itself had been enlisted in the service of endurance. Clara offered tea and made it promptly. They sat across from one another at the scrubbed table, with the quiet gravity of 2 women who had, without saying so directly, agreed that there would be no point in evasion. It was Miss Marple who began. She said that she had been thinking ever since their walk by the green, and again after their conversation in the garden about the longer chain of events behind the bake sale, not merely the competition itself, but the year that had preceded it. She said she believed she had come to understand something of what Dorothy Mere's public criticism the previous summer had meant to Clara, and something more of what that private conversation 3 weeks before the sale had added to it. Clara did not interrupt. Her hands rested around her teacup. Her eyes were very steady. Miss Marple went on quietly. She said that she believed Clara had added something to the lemon tart before bringing it to the parish hall. Not the adjustment to the zest she had described earlier. The recipe card, Miss Marple said, had convinced her that the alteration recorded there was of a different order altogether. She believed Clara had introduced at a late stage a concentrated preparation of some kind, most likely a botanical extract, something capable, in the quantity used, of causing notable physical discomfort to the person who consumed it. She said further that she did not believe Clara had intended grave harm. That part Miss Marple had thought about a great deal. She believed Clara had intended disturbance, enough discomfort to unsettle Dorothy Mere, to diminish her composure, to bring down, if only for a little while, that imposing air of unquestioned judgment she had worn for 23 years, while presiding over competitions and in quieter ways, over lives. She had intended to interrupt authority, to injure dignity, to make a woman who had long distributed approval from a great height feel, however briefly, something smaller and less secure. Miss Marple said all this evenly, without blame in her voice. For a long moment Clara said nothing. There was only the small sound of the fruit loaf settling as it cooled, a faint contraction in the quiet kitchen. Beyond the open window the garden moved softly in the afternoon breeze. Then Clara said, "Yes." She said it with no dramatic flourish, no collapse, no protest. It was a single, complete word, and because it was given so simply, it carried more weight than many speeches. After a short silence, she added that she had not known about Dorothy Mear's heart. She'd known, of course, that Dorothy was no longer young. She had heard her complain of tiredness now and then, but she had not known that Dr. Fenwick had been managing a cardiac condition for some years. She said this not defensively, but with the exhausted clarity of a person to whom the difference between what was known and what was not known had in retrospect become both crucial and unbearable. Miss Marple said quietly that she believed her. Clara bowed her head for a moment, then lifted it again. She explained that the preparation had come from her own stores. She kept a range of concentrated botanical extracts for cordials and liqueurs made occasionally for private functions. She had chosen one she believed, in very small quantity, would cause a degree of digestive distress in a person of ordinary health and no more. She had measured it carefully. She had calculated, she said, as though calculation itself might hold consequence within proper boundaries. She had added it on the morning of the sale just before leaving the house, and afterward, when the thing had been done and could not be undone, she had altered the recipe card. Not, she said, because she expected anyone to inspect it with suspicion, but because she could not bear to see the addition there in her own hand. The amendment was not a record of innocent refinement. It was the trace of a thing she had done and very soon afterward wished not to have to look at. Miss Marple listened without interruption. Clara said that she had expected some discomfort, perhaps some visible discomposure during the judging, perhaps an early departure and a loss of face. Nothing beyond that. She had not expected Dorothy Mear's collapse. And when the blue ribbon had been placed in her hand while Dorothy was being helped into a chair and then assisted out of the hall, she had felt something she had not, in the 8 days since, been able properly to name. Miss Marple said that she was not surprised. There are feelings, she said, which resist description because they are made not of one emotion, but of several contradictory ones arriving all at once: triumph, fear, shame, shock, vindication, disbelief, and no single word is equal to the burden of them. At that, something in Clara's face altered. Not relief exactly, not grief exactly, but something that borrowed from both. She said that she had spent the past week trying to decide whether she was a woman who had made a terrible misjudgment under the pressure of pride and long resentment, or whether she was a fundamentally different sort of person from the one she had always taken herself to be. Miss Marple answered that the very fact she could ask that question honestly, and without immediately rushing to protect herself from the answer, was the strongest evidence in favour of the first possibility. She said it because she believed it. Clara received the remark in silence, but it was a silence of weight rather than refusal. Then she said something Miss Marple had not expected. She said that she and Helen Carter had spoken. Miss Marple had already seen them once together by the War Memorial, and had suspected that some shift had taken place between them. Clara said yes, that had been the beginning of it, though not the whole of it. Their conversation had been, she thought, the most difficult and the most necessary one she had had in years. She did not recount every word of it, but she said this: Helen had not known what Clara had done. Clara, in turn, had not known until Mr. Baverstock mentioned it to Miss Marple that Helen had bought a botanical extract on the Thursday before the sale. When the two of them stood facing that fact together, they had understood something at once and with complete clarity. They had, Clara said, looked at one another with the recognition of two people who had been standing on the same narrow ledge without realizing, until the last moment, how close each had come to the edge. Miss Marple said that must have been clarifying. Clara said that it had. Helen had told her that she never used the extract. It remained unopened in her kitchen and was later thrown away. Whether Helen had truly intended to do anything with it, or whether she had only allowed herself the dangerous comfort of imagining the possibility before drawing back from it, Clara said she did not know. And she did not think it was her place to decide. Miss Marple found this too both fair and truthful. They sat a while longer at the kitchen table, where the air remained warm and fragrant with pastry and honest labour. After that their talk moved, almost gratefully, to other things. A catering order, the state of the garden, summer plans in the village. There was a certain peace in it, not the peace of resolution, but that of two people who have passed through difficulty into mutual understanding, and are content for a little while not to force matters further. When Miss Marple rose to leave, Clara walked with her to the door and stood for a moment with her hands in the pockets of her apron. She said, in a voice very quiet but entirely steady, that she did not know what Miss Marple intended to do with what she had been told. Miss Marple replied that she intended to think about it very carefully. It was the only honest answer, and she added that the right course in such cases was seldom simple and very rarely obvious. One must consider not only what had happened, but what justice, properly understood, would amount to in the particular circumstances. She said this gently but with precision. Then she took her leave and walked back through the lane in the long warm evening light, thinking as she went about arithmetic. Not the sort performed with numbers, but the inward kind, the silent calculations people make at kitchen tables and in sleepless dark rooms, adding injury to pride, subtracting restraint, balancing what one believed oneself to be against what one had in fact done, and trying to discover what remains when the sum is complete. It was, Miss Marple thought, the quiet arithmetic of resentment, and its reckoning was rarely over quickly. Chapter 10. The Blue Ribbon Awarded Elsewhere. The final week of Miss Marple's stay in Wenbury Holt passed with that curious equilibrium which sometimes follows the resolution of a difficult matter. It was not peace precisely, nor the absence of trouble. Rather, it was a stillness of another kind, the calm that comes when the central question has at last been answered, and what remains is the slower, more patient business of consequence. The village continued. St. Edmund's roof remained in need of money. The post office opened at its usual hour. Mrs. Aldous went on organising things with that stern competence which implied she had, privately, taken responsibility for civilization in its local form. The roses along the vicarage wall reached their fullest and most extravagant bloom. Children pursued bicycles and arguments with equal seriousness. Rooks held discussions in the elm by the church and seemed, as always, to regard human affairs with noisy scepticism. Miss Marple walked, observed, knitted, and thought. She took tea with Mrs. Partridge morning and afternoon. She spoke with Mr. Thornbury about the brass memorial tablets, which were in truth rather interesting. On Sunday she attended service and sat in the pew near the south window, where the old glass spread its muted green light over the stones. There, as often in churches, she found herself reflecting upon the distance between intention and consequence, and upon how difficult it is for human beings to bear the gap between the two, without either lying to themselves or despairing. She had done what she promised Clara she would do. She had thought very carefully. The thinking had not been easy, and she had not wanted it to be. Easy judgments are, in her experience, often the least trustworthy. The facts admitted no wholly comfortable arrangement. Clara Bennet had added a substance to food intended for public judging, meaning to cause physical distress to a particular individual. That individual had later died. The fact that Clara had not intended death, that she had been ignorant of Dorothy Mere's heart condition, that the dose had been calculated for discomfort rather than catastrophe, and that Dr. Fenwick had certified the death as consistent with long-standing illness and exertion. None of these erased the act itself. No, but neither did the act exist in a vacuum. Miss Marple had lived too long and observed too much to believe that the true accounting of a human action could be made in a single column. There was the column of provocation, the column of character built over many years, the column of ignorance, the column of unintended consequence. And there was, above all, the question of what justice would actually achieve if one set it in motion, as distinct from what punishment might satisfy in theory. Dr. Fenwick had certified the death. Miss Marple had no reason formally to dispute him. She possessed no evidence of the kind that would serve in any official proceeding beyond the knowledge entrusted to her by a woman's conscience, and the certainty that Clara was already engaged in a reckoning severe enough to leave permanent marks. There was also the question of proportion. Any formal disclosure would destroy Clara utterly. Her catering business, her livelihood, her place in the village, the fragile beginning of restored understanding between herself and Helen, everything would go at once. Miss Marple was not sentimental about such things. She had seen the damage caused by mercy foolishly given, but she was equally unsentimental about punishment when its results were blunt rather than just, and she believed, quietly, firmly, and after a great deal of thought, that in this case the truer justice lay elsewhere. She called on Clara one final time on the Thursday before her departure. It was mid-morning, and Clara was in the garden, tying back climbing roses that had advanced somewhat beyond their proper boundary. She looked up as Miss Marple came through the gate and received her with a composed warmth that had, by now, become something more genuine than composure alone. They sat together on the small bench against the garden wall. At first they talked of ordinary things. Clara had secured a substantial commission for a wedding the following month, a 3-day undertaking involving elaborate preparation and the kind of concentration-skilled work both requires and rewards. She described it not boastfully, but with the precise, unshowy satisfaction of a woman discussing craft she respects. Miss Marple listened with equal pleasure. She had always thought that to hear a capable person speak honestly of good work was one of the more civilizing experiences available in life. Then, in the natural quiet that followed one subject before the next began, Miss Marple said what she had come to say. She told Clara that she had reached her conclusion, and then, directly, without qualification or softening, she told her that she did not intend to take the matter further. She said it plainly because anything less plain would have been unfair. Then she added with equal directness that this was not because she believed Clara's action was trivial or without moral weight or somehow erased by regret. It was because she had considered the specific person, the specific circumstances, and the specific question of what course would most nearly serve justice in its fullest sense. She told Clara that there was a great difference between being left alone and being absolved, and that she trusted her to understand it. Clara did understand. Indeed, what showed in her face was not the light, slack relief of someone reprieved, but something heavier and more serious, the relief of a person being told that she must carry her own burden rather than have it carried publicly for her. She said simply that she understood, and the words had the quality not of acceptance, but of commitment. They sat a little longer in the garden, where the bees moved industriously among the blossoms, and the roses leaned outward with that abundant confidence June always gives them. Very little more was said. It seemed to Miss Marple that words had by then reached the limit of what they could usefully accomplish. In the days that followed, certain matters resolved themselves with quiet inevitability. Clara withdrew her entry from the following summer's bake competition, citing the demands of her professional schedule. Mrs. Aldis accepted the explanation without fuss. There are some inquiries efficient women know not to make. Helen Carter, with characteristic energy, pursued the scholarship fund with Mr. Alderton and Dorothy Mere's family representatives. The discussions, rather to everyone's surprise, proved fruitful. The family had been aware of Dorothy's intentions, and as families sometimes do when a wish has been clearly expressed, chose to honour them despite the absence of the formal instrument that would have made such honour obligatory. The fund would proceed. It would bear Dorothy Mere's name. The first award was expected the following spring. Mr. Thornbury received the news about the church finances with the admirable composure of a clergyman long resigned to the mysterious and not always convenient relationship between divine providence and structural masonry. Friday morning brought Miss Marple's departure. Her bag was packed with her usual neatness, Mrs. Partridge's preserves secured carefully among her things so that they might survive the journey, and the farewell on the front step was conducted with the mixture of affection and practicality proper to old friendship. Mrs. Partridge said she'd been the most welcome guest imaginable. Miss Marple replied that she'd had a most instructive visit, which was, she thought, the truest description available. Mrs. Partridge gave her the look of one who suspects that restful and instructive are not precisely synonymous, but is too well bred to insist upon the distinction. Miss Marple crossed the green for the last time toward the motor car waiting to take her to the station. At the bench by the war memorial she paused and sat for a moment, knitting bag in her lap, face turned toward the morning sun. Wenbury Holt moved on around her. A delivery arrived at the grocer's. 2 children disputed ownership of a bicycle with the bright determination of youth. The rooks in the elm held a brief consultation and fell quiet. The clock in St. Edmund's Tower struck the 1/4 hour with the decisive confidence of something that had been making the same announcement for generations and saw no reason whatever to revise it. At last Miss Marple rose and made her way to the car. She did not look back when it turned from the lane onto the main road. Yet just before the turn she had a last impression of something pale between 2 rooftops. Perhaps the remnants of bunting from the parish hall, perhaps only washing on a line. Either image, she thought, would have served equally well. Villagers have a gift for carrying on, laundering their troubles and pinning them out in whatever sunlight can be found. As the hedgerows began their quiet procession past the window, Miss Marple settled her knitting bag more comfortably in her lap, and reflected that domestic arts require patience above all. The patience to learn, the patience to practice, the patience to accept that even the most careful preparation may produce an unforeseen result, and perhaps the greatest patience of all, to go on living decently in the knowledge of one's own capacity for error, without either denying it or surrendering to it altogether. Without that patience, Miss Marple thought, even sweetness, however skilfully made, may in the end turn bitter. The road stretched ahead in the generous light of morning, and Wenbury Holt receded by degrees into that pleasant middle distance occupied by places one has left, but not yet quite finished thinking about.